In this case, we're really going to change steam. McCullen v. Coakley, the issue that exists is abortion. But it's not abortion in the sense that we've talked about in the previous cases. This case hinges upon First Amendment speech rights because the issue here isn't the legality of abortion. It's about how a state can restrict protesters with regards to abortion. And this is only the most recent in a long line of case law that addresses this issue. And the reason why we're doing this case is because it's the most recent. And also because, to bury the lead a little bit, this is a 9-0 unanimous case that upholds the right of abortion protesters. And so while we think of the procedure of abortion as being a very strongly hinged ideological issue, and it is, the issue about abortion protesters does not appear, nor has ever really truly appeared, to be as strongly contested an ideological issue. And the court has time and time again upheld these sorts of rights in the faces of outright bans, the type of which we'll talk about in McCullen. So what is the background in this case? Well, in 2007, Massachusetts passed a law that instituted a 35-foot buffer zone around all ways of ingress to abortion clinics. And the purpose by which it did so was to prevent the harassment and interference with individuals who are approaching abortion clinics for the services that the clinics provided. The law went a little broader than that. The individuals who are petitioning this case traditionally engage in what is known as pro-life counseling outside of abortion clinics. And so there's a previous precedent, which we're not going to deal with in Colorado, that was similar. We're going to deal mainly with the First Amendment issue because this is going to harken back to what we did in the first section of our course. And so the question in this case is, did the First Circuit incorrectly rule that the law was constitutional under the First Amendment? There's no reason to say anything else. That the court is unanimous in this regard. Though when we assess the differences in the concurrences, you'll see there's a little bit of disagreement. But in terms of the outcome of this case, the court unanimously rules that the Massachusetts law in question runs afoul of the First Amendment's protection against freedom of speech. Chief Justice John Roberts writes this majority opinion and argues that the law itself is content neutral, as it bans individuals of approaching would-be clients within 35 yards. And so that sense, it's content neutral. But the state still has to demonstrate that there exists an engaging state reason for the restriction. And they say that the state can't do that because they're denying the petitioners what we consider traditional free speech areas, which is sidewalks, public streets, traditional free speech zones. And so the restriction in essence is overbroad because it places a burden upon areas in which free speech traditionally happens. Public streets and sidewalks are seen as areas in which individuals can engage in and often do engage in protest, speech, etc. And the law in question, by restricting those in totality within 35 yards, is an overbroad ruling and places a significant burden on speech. The two concurrences I want to focus on are Justice Scalia's and Justice Alito's. So Justice Scalia writes that this is absolutely, the law in question is absolutely a content-based law, and that it absolutely has to be regulated under strict scrutiny. So he agrees in the outcome of the case. The law is unconstitutional, but he disagrees that the law was content neutral, as the majority opinion says. He says the law is absolutely not content neutral, it's content-based. And because the blanket prohibition on speech was in areas in which only one type of politically charged speech was going to take place. And so the law in question, while written facially appears to be content neutral, it's only targeting one type of speech. And therefore, it has to be content-based. So in the same way that things like the grandfather clause were written in such a way as to not be discriminatory, the effect of the law was absolutely discriminatory. It's the difference between de jure and de facto. And what Scalia is arguing here is like, this is de facto content-based, even if the language is content neutral. And so he agrees that he thinks that strict scrutiny would have to apply, and that the law would again be struck down. Alito writes in a separate opinion in which he argued that since the law had an exemption in it for clinic employees and volunteers, so individuals who worked at the clinic and individuals who volunteered at the clinic, that exception was viewpoint discrimination, because it shut out everyone who was opposed to abortion and allowed clinic workers and supporters to express their views. I think in many ways, Scalia has an extremely salient point. Alito does not. And I think that as a court observer, that's often the case. Scalia has a way, and he does in this case, of getting to the point and pointing out what is really going on, and doing so and articulating it in a very understandable way. Alito doesn't have that ability. Now, don't get me wrong, Scalia and Alito are equally ideological in terms of the way they make decisions and the positions that they vote for and argue for. Scalia just does it better. He does it in a way that it doesn't seem that he's wrapped law around a decision he wanted to make ideologically. He writes in such a way that makes it seem that the law agrees with his ideological take. When Alito writes, as he did in this case, it seems like his ideology is perverting his interpretation of the law. And that's a very different approach. Scalia is a better writer, no doubt there, but he's also much more adept at crafting opinions. And so Scalia's concurrence here, while it agrees with the majority, really does make one sit back and think about the nature of this restriction. Because when the Massachusetts legislature passed this law, they knew exactly what type of speech they were targeting. They were targeting abortion protesters, and they wrote a law in such a way that it textually doesn't invoke these protesters, but absolutely on paper, it only affects the protesters. And I suppose one can normatively disagree that abortion protesters should have these venues available. But if you agree that the First Amendment protects speech upon which you disagree with, and that when the government makes laws based upon the content of what is being said, that those laws should be subjected to the highest level of scrutiny possible, then it seems plausible to agree with Justice Scalia's opinion. And I would argue so much so that I'm persuaded by his take here, regardless of the fact that I disagree with the policy outcome. his opinion is more persuasive to me than Justice Roberts' majority opinion.